one of the problems with Java syntax is you kind of do just have to memorize where certain things occur and use code as an example. So let's go through each of these. I'm going to start by building this file, and I'm going to name my class, we'll call it syntax. Now, a couple things. Notice how I immediately put in my beginning and my ending brackets for the class. All of our program is going to be written between these two curly brackets. Notice also, again, that I'm following the convention of capitalizing the name of my class. So, inside of those curly brackets, I'm going to hit the tab key, and notice how my cursor's moved over a tab stop. Usually when we nest things inside of curly brackets, we tab over because it makes it easier to see. Now, before I even go that far, notice how I'm using this format for matching up curly brackets. Some people find this to be a bit difficult. This tends to be because I come from more of a scripting background than a formal programming background. So for this lecture, what I will actually do is I'm going to switch from a format that I normally use, and I'm going to line up all of my curly brackets along a left alignment. So notice in this case, this set of curly brackets is the opening and closing set of curly brackets for this entire program. Okay, now I'm going to tab in. I want to nest something between the outer statement. You can kind of think of curly brackets as enclosing paragraphs of information if you really want to use that metaphor. So I'm going to go ahead and set up my main method. Don't ask why I think I need to capitalize it. And now I'm going to go ahead and immediately put in the opening and closing curly brackets that are associated with my main method. And a couple of people have asked, what is the main method? And the main method is officially the entry point for our program. In other words, later on in this semester and in other programming courses, you're going to have multiple classes, and when you run the program's going to go, well, where do I start? There's 10.java files here. Which one do I need to start from? And the main method is really what we call our entry point. Okay, and it's just something that Java expects to see. So now I'm going to go inside of this set of curly brackets. Before we even move there, notice no semicolon at the end of line 1. Notice no semicolon at the end of line 5. All right, so in this case is these components, this is a method, and this method specifically is encased by curly brackets. The class definition is encased by curly brackets. We haven't actually used any semicolons yet. So what I'm going to do is actually go back up to line 1 and use an import statement. When we use import statements, okay, they end in a semicolon. So you just kind of have to get used to that as well. Now let's go ahead and start using some more complex constructs here. I'm going to declare a variable, and I'm going to set it to 0. Notice that when I declare a variable, I end that line with a semicolon. A few other things to notice in my code is notice I'm putting a space between my variable name and the assignment operator, and a space between the value I'm assigning to the variable and the value. And notice I put my semicolons directly behind the line. So semicolon is more like a simple statement. If you want to think of curly brackets as being separators for paragraphs, you can think of semicolons as being periods in a sentence. Okay? So simple statements end with semicolons. There are exceptions to every rule. So now let's go ahead and set up an if statement and talk about how if statements. And we'll say if I is, just some random number less than 10. Now, a couple of people have noticed that in an if statement, you don't need curly brackets. And I'm going to put I is less than 10 in here. The only time you do not need curly brackets, so if statements do not need curly brackets if there is only one simple statement beneath the condition. So in this case, the condition is the expression that's inside of the inside of the parentheses. And notice that's something else you need to realize is that in an if statement, we use parentheses, not curly brackets, to indicate the condition. Now, a lot of people were confused because they were setting up if statements, and then they were doing things like this, and having two statements. Now, here's the problem. When you don't use curly brackets with an if statement, the only line that is associated with the condition is the line immediately after it. If you have multiple conditions, and let's copy this so we can have multiple examples here. I also want to make sure that I keep everything lined up, and I'll make this file available for you. So I'm going to remove this. This is valid, okay, because I have one statement beneath my condition. This is invalid. What's going to happen is line 18 is associated with the if statement, line 19 is not. How do I go about indicating that I want both of these lines to be associated with the if statement? I wrap them in curly brackets. What this does is it forces the compiler to see these two lines and make these two lines associated with this branch of the if statement. What's the best way if this confuses you and you're not sure how to deal with this? Well, I'm going to go ahead and add another line up here. Make sure I get all my formatting correct for you. To avoid confusion, always use curly brackets with if statements. It's a few extra things to type, but I think what you're going to find out is that it makes understanding the code a little bit easier. So, semicolons and simple statements, single line if statements do not require curly brackets, but you should use them anyway to help you format your code. Again, notice every time I'm inside a set of curly brackets, I indent. Also notice how easy it is to say, oh, line 20's curly bracket is opening, and line 22 curly bracket goes with that, and it's closing curly bracket. So notice how this formatting that I'm using is really key to how I'm setting up my code. So what if we wanted to do an if-else statement? Well, let's see here. We'll use curly brackets for multiple lines of code associated with a condition. So what if we have an if side to the, well, we've got an if statement. What if we have an else statement here? So we'll stick with our friendly neighborhood first example. Notice that because I only have one line beneath the else statement, I don't need curly brackets. So we'll say same rules of curly bracket use apply to if else statements. But you should still use curly brackets. And so what I'll do is copy this and give you an example to look at that. And how would we do this? Well, let's use my same way of formatting. It takes up a few more extra spaces. Remember, white space is any character that actually adds some space around your brackets or your code. So in other words, I'm using a new line character to help me line these up. And notice how easy it is to see that these curly brackets go with that else statement, and that these curly brackets go with that if statement, and things are disassociated from one another. Okay, so I'm going to also indicate here, always use curly brackets in the beginning to avoid confusion. We can go up here, and now we can see how this looks with multiple statements. So we'll do same example, but with multiple lines of code and an else statement. And you can probably guess at this point how I'm going to format this. And I could have copied that and pasted it. So there are some examples for if statements and how we actually go about formatting them. What if you have an if statement inside of an if statement? The same rules as above apply. So let's set up an if-else statement. So if I is less than 10, we'll jump down in here. And let's say if like I is between 0 and 10, right? So I'm going to set up another if statement. I'm going to say if I is greater than 0. Notice how I tab in. and how easy it is to see that this if statement is associated with those two curly brackets, and that this if statement is associated with those outer curly brackets. So I'm using vertical alignment to help me identify how my curly brackets match up. By the way, notice the only place I've used semicolons in any of this code is at the end of my lines, because in if statement use, we're not too concerned about semicolons. So let's move on and look at loops. And what we'll do is we'll just continue to use my variables. Hopefully all this compiles, but it's more about syntax at this point. So let's take a look at a while loop. So while I is less than 10, notice just like the if statement, notice the only difference really between a while statement and an if statement is that the while statement uses the keyword while, and if statements use the keyword if. So notice there's no semicolon here. Notice I have a set of curly brackets around here. Notice that if I only had one line after the while statement, I could forego the curly brackets. But guess what? I'm going to tell you always use curly brackets with loops to avoid confusion. Okay, so I'm not even going to show it to you without them. .out, .println, I is. Then what we'll do is we'll do I plus plus, and now I've got two lines after the statement. So that's why I went ahead. Notice again, no semicolons. Now let's look at a do while loop. Remember, what's the difference between a do while loop? Do while loops check the condition after the loop executes and not before. Okay, so think of it like this. I may have said this in another lecture, but a while loop asks questions first and then shoots. Think of like an old Western, right? So they always say you can shoot first and ask questions, or ask questions and shoot. Ask questions first and then shoot, or shoot first and then ask questions. In the case of a while loop, we ask questions first. We check the condition and then we continue on to check the executed code. In a do while loop, we actually go ahead. You know what's interesting is, I'll have to see if I remember the syntax. I always get Java syntax confused with other pieces of with other operating systems. So we'll just go here. Alright, and what I'm going to do is copy and paste this into my do while loop. And the other thing I'm going to do is notice that in my last piece of code, here by the way, I was increasing I, so I is now equal to 10. I'm just going to reset I to 0. So what happens here is we go to the do statement, we enter into the body of the loop, these two lines are executed, and then we get to the while and the condition is checked. Now, here's some odd syntax. The only time you ever see a semicolon after a condition is in a do while loop. So I think I could always be wrong on that. There are other times, but in this case, they would be kind of odd if you did it. So in this case, there's this little hanging semicolon here. It took me forever to remember this. Again, notice how I format my code in this case. If I want to, let's be consistent. This curly bracket is associated with this curly bracket. Notice how my tabs, notice I'm consistent, by the way. If you scroll up in my code, all right, you'll notice that there's nice vertical lines along tab stops. These are my nested statements. Moving in and down, you see the next line of code. If I had more code, they would be nested over and using tabs. Think of like an outline. It allows your eye to easily follow. Notice I use white space between these. Notice I'm using comments. Notice there's an aesthetic to writing code. So do while loop should look like this. Again, the do while loop is kind of like an odd exception, so you just have to remember how to set it up. I'm going to use J for this, just because I can. Now I'm going to use a for loop. And I'm going to go back and grab one of my lines of code here so I can avoid typing it again. And get this set up. Oops, that was weird. have some type of, you really should be paying attention to how things are formatted. So for loops have unique syntax inside the condition, but everything else should look familiar. I type fast but not accurate. So notice that I've got a for statement, I've got a condition inside of parentheses, I've got my curly brackets, there's no semicolon, but there's no semicolon after my condition, right? But inside of my condition, it's a specially formatted one just for loops. So to the left of the first semicolon allows me to initialize my loop control variable. To the right of the first semicolon is my condition to determine how long my loops should execute. And after my second semicolon, I have a variable incrementer. In other words, in this case, it's going to walk my variable from 0 to 10. And actually, you know what? There was a question about can loops go backwards, so let's go from 10. All right. To 0. And we'll do j minus minus. So this loop will go backwards. So count down from 10 to 0. Actually 10 to 1. So this is the format for a for loop, and this is how I expect you guys to format your loops and your if statements. Switch statements are probably the one last thing that's a little bit weird. Let's see, like a good switch statement would be char my character. Let's just set up a little variable here. I don't really need to do it this way, but just kind of demonstrate it. We'll switch off of the my character variable. Now, the big question is going to be, notice like the way I format my code is very hard for me to set things up. Question is, can I actually do this off the top of my head? The reason I'm asking is I'm writing a lot of Objective-C code at the moment, so let's see if I can do this. And let's not teach you to format this like that. Let's do that. So for switch statements, I'm going to compile this and make sure I actually got this right. Actually save my file. Let's see if this actually compiles. Didn't see any mistakes. Look at that. No mistakes. Syntax lecture with no mistakes. I'm going to run it. And I did get my syntax right. So let's explore the switch case syntax now that I know I'm exactly correct. I've got the keyword switch and a condition, and notice this is the same as my for loop, the same as my if statement. I have a statement identifier, I have a condition followed by a pair of curly brackets. Inside of the curly brackets, I have a case statement, and again, this is one of those odd places where you're going to have to make some memorization if you choose to use case statements. Case is the keyword, followed by the item you want to review, followed by a colon. There aren't a lot of colons used in programming languages, but the semicolon is probably more predominant. But in this case, a colon is the proper operator in that case. I have multiple lines. After that, notice there are no curly brackets associated with this. Notice the break statement is in there. Notice the default statement follows that same format. So let's throw a case in here to match the variable I just set up. And we'll also do one that does a capital A, just for, completeness with the case statement and fun stuff it can do. Again, what's more important here is the syntax and the layout. A lot of people have been asking, like, okay, where do I put curly brackets? Notice that I could, there's nothing stopping me from putting curly brackets anywhere in my code, right? It actually will compile. This is correct. In fact, sometimes you might use curly brackets for like a syntactical separator in some of your code, just more like to help you organize things, but most of the time you won't. What's most important is to take a look at this file, memorize the rules of where curly brackets go. If you're confused about where they go, use them everywhere that they're required. All right, so as I scroll back up, I see a lot of people setting up if statements like I have here on line 14 and 15, and it confuses them, right? Because they think that they don't ever need curly brackets. So that when we get to line 19, 20, 21, and 22, this is the more proper way. If you get into using curly brackets everywhere they're required. I may have missed some syntax here, so if there's something missing, let me know. We can address it on the discussion board. But I just meant this to be a quick walkthrough, not the most organized lecture. It's very specific, so hopefully this is helpful to you. If you still have questions about formatting, I'll post this code along with this video lecture, and it's important that you also take time to look at how I format my code, look at how you format your code. I don't put out an official style guide in this class, but I expect that you look at what I do and mimic that. Proper formatted code goes a long way. You would never hand in an English paper that was just a bunch of random sentences on paper, unless it's kind of like a postmodern graphic design course or